The day had started out like any other. I woke up early, made coffee, and sat down to enjoy the morning paper. Mark was already gone, off to work as usual. As I sipped my coffee, the headline jumped out at me: "Prominent businessman dies suddenly of heart attack." I almost spilled my drink when I saw the photo underneath. It was my father-in-law, John. My hands shook as I read through the article. John had collapsed the previous evening while working late at his office. By the time the night janitor found him, it was too late. He was pronounced dead on arrival at the hospital. The article praised him as a captain of industry, a self-made man who worked his way up from humble beginnings to build a successful company. I was stunned. Just 2 nights ago, Mark and I had dinner with John at his favorite steakhouse. He looked perfectly healthy and was in an upbeat mood. How could this be? My insides knotted with grief as the reality set in. John was the only parent Mark and I had left. Losing him so abruptly was devastating. I dialed Mark's cell phone with trembling fingers. When he answered, I could barely get the words out to tell him the news. He went completely silent on the other end of the line. Then I heard him take a sharp breath. "I'll be right there," he said quietly before hanging up. About 20 minutes later, I heard the front door fly open. Mark rushed in, face pale, clutching a crumpled newspaper. I leapt up from the table and threw my arms around him. We held each other tightly, both of us fighting back tears. Eventually we sat down, faces grim. We talked for hours about John, sharing memories, comforting each other. In a way, it was cathartic. But we both knew life would never be quite the same without him. The next few days passed by in a fog. We had to plan John's funeral, meet with his lawyers about the will and the estate, speak to his business associates, even address the press who wanted a comment. I handled most of the logistics to allow Mark time to properly grieve. John was his last living relative after all. The morning of the funeral arrived dull and overcast. Fitting weather, I thought morosely. Mark and I were the only ones attending the burial service besides the minister. John had been alone in the world except for us. A lifetime of putting business first had left him with no close friends. Watching his casket lower into the ground, I slipped an arm around Mark's waist, lending support. He put his arm around my shoulder and pulled me close. At least we still had each other. As we turned to go, a figure across the cemetery caught my eye. A man stood in the shadow of a large oak tree, hands thrust in his pockets, watching us intently. He looked to be about Mark's age, medium height and build, wearing jeans and a black leather jacket. His gaze followed us as we walked to our car. I shivered slightly. There was something unsettling about him I couldn't quite put my finger on. "Do you know that man?" I asked Mark, tipping my head in the stranger's direction. Mark peered across the cemetery with a small frown. "No idea who he is. Never seen him before in my life." I shrugged it off as we drove away. With the stress of the past few days, I was probably just being paranoid. Still, I couldn't help but feel a lingering sense of unease about the mysterious figure. Over the next week, I tried focusing on more positive things, like the fact that John's will had left everything to Mark and me. The house, the business, investments, savings, it was all ours now. No more struggling to make ends meet or accumulating debt. Maybe this blessing was John's way of taking care of us even in death. By the weekend, I felt like I could finally breathe again. On Saturday morning, the doorbell rang just as I was cleaning up the breakfast dishes. When I opened the front door, there stood the man from the cemetery. Up close, his eyes were an icy blue-gray that seemed to bore right through me. He gave me a thin smile. "You probably don't remember me, but I'm an old friend of John's. Name's Jack." He stuck out a hand. I was out of the country during his service, or else I would have paid my respects. Just found out about his passing from the paper last week. I shook his hand uncertainly. "I'm sorry, I don't think John ever mentioned you. How did you know to find us here?" His smile wavered for a split second before the genial mask slipped back into place. "Oh, John and I go way back. We were like brothers. I probably have you to thank for making his last years so happy, taking care of him and the business after his wife died." I nodded slowly, still not quite sure what to make of this man. Before I could say anything else, Mark came up behind me. "Who's this?" he asked with a confused look. The man extended his hand again. "The name's Jack. Knew your father for many years. I was just telling your lovely wife here that I wanted to stop by and offer my condolences in person." Mark's eyes narrowed slightly. "That's very considerate of you. Please come in." He stepped back so Jack could enter. As he passed me, that unsettled feeling gripped my stomach again. I wished Mark hadn't invited him in so readily. But it was too late now. All we could do was hear the man out. We headed to the living room and took seats across from our guest. I studied him carefully as Mark offered him something to drink. He declined, leaning forward eagerly in his chair instead. Like I said, John and I were very close over the years. He often confided in me about personal matters, regrets, dreams, secrets. Things he didn't share with most people. Mark and I exchanged a skeptical glance. This was news to us. John had always been rather private, even with family. Jack continued, one of his biggest regrets was not reconciling with his younger son, Jake. I understand Jake ran away when he was just a teenager. John searched for him for years to no avail. He felt he failed the boy. It weighed heavily on his conscience right up until the end. I shifted uncomfortably. John had briefly mentioned a rebellious son who disappeared long ago, but refused to discuss it further. I had no idea the estrangement had plagued him so. Mark looked equally surprised. Our father never told me any of that, he said. He led me to believe I was his only son. I didn't even know this Jake existed. Jack nodded. Yes, it was too painful for him to talk about. But he wanted to make amends with the boy. That's why. He trailed off, averting his gaze. That's why what? Mark pressed. Jack reached into his jacket pocket and retrieved a folded document. This is difficult for me to share since I consider John like a brother. But he explicitly instructed me to give this to Jake if anything happened to him. He passed the document to Mark. I read over his shoulder as he rapidly scanned the page, confusion mounting on his face. When he finished, he looked up angrily. This appears to be a handwritten will signed by our father. But rather than leave his estate to me, his only living son, he's bequeathed everything to this long-lost Jake person. A complete stranger. My pulse quickened as I reread the document in disbelief. Mark was sole heir in the legal will. Why would John suddenly claim another son and leave him everything instead? It made no sense. Mark glared accusingly at Jack. What exactly are you playing at here? This has to be some kind of forgery or scam. Jack threw his hands up defensively. Whoa, no need to attack me. I'm just the messenger. John insisted I deliver this alternate will to Jake if anything happened to him. To make amends for the past, you know? I don't necessarily agree with his decision, but a dying man's last wish is sacred. I had to honor it. I studied him closely. Was he speaking the truth or just a skilled liar? His expression seemed earnest enough beneath the scruff and leather jacket exterior, but an uneasy feeling still lingered. Mark stood abruptly, fists clenched around the false will. I won't let some criminal brother we never knew swoop in and steal our rightful inheritance. There must be some mistake. I'll get to the bottom of this. He stormed out of the room, no doubt heading to his study to call John's legal team. They would certainly confirm which will was valid. This whole thing had to be a farce. I shifted awkwardly in my seat, alone now with the shady man calling himself Jack. His eyes followed Mark's departure before swiveling back to me, glinting strangely. You'll have to forgive my husband, I said evenly. As you can imagine, this is quite a shock. Oh, I understand completely, Jack replied. I expected resistance to such an unconventional arrangement. The corner of his mouth twitched upward ever so slightly. A knot formed in my stomach. Maybe it was nerves or paranoia, but I couldn't shake the feeling this man knew more than he let on. I stood abruptly. Please excuse me a moment. Can I get you that drink now? No need. He checked an expensive-looking watch. I should really be going anyway. But perhaps we could continue this conversation soon? John shared some other private matters you may find relevant. Of course, I responded automatically, wanting nothing more than for him to leave. I led Jack back to the foyer, holding the front door open expectantly. He paused before crossing the threshold, peering around the room one last time with an odd smile. A chill went down my spine. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something seemed off about his demeanor. Too confident. Too cocky even. Like he held all the cards. Well, it was truly lovely to meet John's daughter-in-law, he said, taking my hand in both of his. I can see why he was so devoted to you both. I look forward to resolving this little inheritance issue amicably. With that, he strode to a shiny black car parked along the curb, leaving me staring after him uneasily. I had an ominous suspicion this wouldn't be our last encounter. Over the next few weeks, life became increasingly chaotic. The alternate will threw things into upheaval. John's lawyers confirmed it had no legal standing, yet Jack remained insistent it represented John's true final wishes. Matters only got worse when a guy named Frank Hartley stepped forward claiming to be Jake's attorney. He filed an injunction questioning the estate's dispersal and even threatened a lawsuit. Meanwhile, rumors about Mark and me began circulating our social circles and local papers. Accusations of shady business practices, embezzlement, even possible involvement in John's death. We were flabbergasted. It seemed Jack and this lawyer were deliberately trying to sabotage our reputation while challenging our rightful inheritance. But the worst was yet to come. Late one night as we returned from a tense business dinner, red and blue lights suddenly flashed behind us. I turned to see a police cruiser pulling up fast. "Pull over to the shoulder and show me your hands," a voice boomed through a loudspeaker. Confused and rattled, Mark did as instructed. Moments later, our car was swarmed by officers in bulletproof vests, guns drawn. They yanked open our doors, shouting at us to get out slowly with hands raised. I was too stunned to even process what was happening as they slammed me against the cruiser and handcuffed me. "You have the right to remain silent," came the Miranda warning amidst the chaotic scene. "There's been some mistake." Mark was yelling, "We're innocent." But the cops ignored his protests. They were taking us into custody for drug trafficking after apparently finding a sizable stash of illegal substances cleverly hidden in Mark's trunk. Possession of unlicensed firearms was also mentioned. It was only when we arrived at the county jail for booking that the gravity of the situation hit me. We were being framed by someone. It had to be Jack behind this elaborate setup, filing a contesting will, tarnishing our standing, and now planting false evidence and guiding the cops to discover it. It seemed an awful lot of effort just to inherit a business from a man he supposedly considered a good friend. No part of his story was adding up. I had a horrible gut feeling this went much deeper than anyone realized. John's long-lost son showing up to claim his fortune? It was starting to look more and more like something you'd see in the movies. The weeks that followed were bleak to say the least. Mark and I languished behind bars, our lives and livelihoods falling apart on the outside. The crystalline truth was obvious to us, but our claims of a frame-up conspiracy seemed flimsy to investigators without evidence. Other prisoners learned of our supposed crimes and hounded us relentlessly about our drug empire riches. The harassment was endless. Guards turned a blind eye to beatings and theft of our commissary. All part of the anarchic justice system, I guess. Punish anyone accused of harming society no matter the verdict. An unspoken cruelty I'd never understood until experiencing it firsthand. Through all this, Jack maintained a strong media presence, putting on theatrics about carrying out poor John's final wishes. He really was an excellent actor. If I didn't know better, I'd think he genuinely cared about his newfound father and brother. His wounded good guy routine had most people eating out of his hand. Then came the darkest hour to date. We were pulled from our cells by guards one night and led to an isolated visitation room. My eyes widened in dismay to see Jack sitting there with a victoriously smug expression. An icy hand gripped my heart. Whatever he wanted, it couldn't be good. After exchanging false pleasantries, he dove right in. "As you know, your estate is now firmly in my control. But it's not me you should be worrying about. I recently sold the entire property and holdings to an eager buyer, Mr. Antonio Bianchi." Mark and I exchanged alarmed looks at the name. Tony Bianchi was a notoriously ruthless figure rumored to head the Italian mob in a neighboring city. If he now owned the business and assets. Jack continued calmly, "Mr. Bianchi has plans to utilize the infrastructure for certain operations best kept discreet. I'm to receive a handsome finder's fee for facilitating the deal." He went on describing Bianchi's plans, but I'd stopped listening. My knees nearly buckled, realizing the expansive legitimate enterprise John built up over decades, along with our family's livelihood, was essentially gone. Signed over to organized crime lords without a second thought. "Well, that concludes the business portion of our visit," Jack finally said, sitting back with a satisfied grin. "Now to discuss the ongoing legal matters." He opened a briefcase on the table between us, removing several alarming items. Crime scene photos of John lying dead with lurid red lesions on his face, presumably from poison. A vial of toxic chemicals marked as evidence. Pages of what appeared to be digitally created bank statements showing money transfers from our accounts to offshore havens. And finally, printouts of encrypted emails discussing some murder-for-hire plot involving the two of us. I struggled to process this bombshell of fabricated documents and staged photos undoubtedly created to frame us. Jack neatened the papers with a smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. "Nasty evidence that recently came to light," he remarked casually. "Multiple experts have authenticated it all as irrefutably genuine. Indicates you two conspired to kill poor John via obscure toxin. Quite damning." My legs wobbled dangerously as his implications sank in. The evidence, manufactured as it was, combined with our tarnished reputations, could be just enough to convict us of murdering my father-in-law. Jack leaned forward, steepling his fingers menacingly. Of course, it would be a terrible shame if such details came out publicly. Might even warrant a death penalty. However, his expression turned bargaining. I could be persuaded to make this evidence disappear before trial. He sat back once more, eyeing us shrewdly. Naturally, I'd require something in return for my help and silence, relinquishing all remaining claims over the estate for starters, and perhaps signing a sworn statement finally bequeathing everything, assets, property, accounts, shares, to me as John's sole beneficiary per his last genuine wish. His lips spread in a triumphant grin. Do we have an understanding? Rage and despair churned inside me as his extortionate gambit crystallized. We were backed fully against a wall now. I could see no way out of this meticulously crafted trap. No choice but to let this diabolical mastermind have his way. Mark and I left in defeated silence after Jack concluded his visit. Once back in our bleak cells, we collapsed on our bunks utterly depleted. Holding each other close, we wept. For our stolen futures, our dissolved hopes, for my father-in-law's good name smeared by this stranger's lies. It all still seemed surreal, like some Kafkaesque nightmare we'd wake up from. But the cold metal cuffs chafing our wrists served as a constant reminder this was anything but a dream. It was our devastating new reality. And the nightmare wasn't over yet. The trial started a month later, the court date Jack conveniently rushed along by leveraging his powerful new criminal backers. Mark and I shuffled into the courtroom linked together by chains, branded murderers, and drug traffickers before proceedings even began. Orange jumpsuits replacing our usual business attire. I searched the gallery desperately for a sympathetic face, but found only cold stares and whispers. Our family and friends had all vanished, either believing the lies and wanting no association, or warned away out of fear from retribution. The prosecution's table was occupied by the smirking team of Jack and Frank Hartley, his barrister-conspirator. Alongside sat the corrupt detective, Mike Reeves, who orchestrated our initial arrest. The three main players in Jack's elaborate plan to steal everything from us. Our own defendant's table was glaringly empty. No legal counsel had stepped forward to take our case pro bono. None would risk opposing the formidable criminal forces now aligned against us behind the scenes. The hearing played out as a lopsided sham. The prosecution spouted their fabricated evidence and manipulated discoveries allegedly proving our hand in John's murder by poison. They produced falsified financial records, making us appear guilty of embezzlement and money laundering. Detective Reeves gave convincing testimony about uncovering the planted stash of drugs and weapons. With each deceptive revelation, gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd at our obvious corruption and cruelty. I wanted desperately to shout the truth. This was all lies and staging. But I knew it was hopeless. Jack had crafted an airtight frame-up job. As the final damning proof was presented, Jack turned in his seat to lock eyes with me, his expression dripping with conceit. In that moment I saw his soul clearly for the first time. A sadistic, rapacious monster who destroyed lives for sport. The true face of evil hiding behind his handsome mask. Rage boiled inside at how thoroughly we'd been played by this diabolical scheme. Mark and I were utterly helpless, without resources or allies to fight back. Our fates rested fully at the mercy of Jack's tangled web of deception. After only an hour of the prosecution laying out their case, the judge banged his gavel calling court into recess to begin jury deliberations. A worrying sign suggesting he'd already made up his mind about the verdict. As we were led away in shackles, the feeling of sheer hopelessness pressed down like a lead weight. The justice system had failed us completely. Once the jury predictably returned to condemn us, we would spend our remaining days wasting away in prison still claiming innocence, or worse yet, strapped to gurneys to receive lethal injections. Back in our dank holding cell, Mark and I sat huddled together, sobbing quietly. All words had left us. We simply clung to one another trying to process the nightmare circumstances. My heart shattered realizing this trial predetermined by malicious lies was likely the last moments we'd share as a couple before being ripped apart forever. Time lost meaning as we waited numbly for the jury to return. Minutes stretched to hours. The occasional shouts and clangs from the cell block reminded us this was reality no matter how unbelievable. Finally, after an interminable interim, guards appeared to escort us back to hear our fate. As we shuffled into the courtroom, my knees nearly buckled with dread. This was it. The culmination of Jack's grand plan to see us ruined and sentenced for crimes we didn't commit. I braced myself preparing to hear the words that would end our freedom and future. But instead of sitting confidently at his table, Jack was curiously absent from the courtroom. Murmurs rippled through the crowd at this unexpected development. The judge, too, seemed unnerved by the prosecutor's unexplained disappearance. After several long moments of awkward pause with no sign of his return, the judge instructed guards to bring us back to our cells so he could assess matters. Mark and I exchanged mystified glances but didn't dare get our hopes up. Not when we remained so firmly ensnared in this intricate trap. Word reached us a short time later that Jack had mysteriously vanished. But any fleeting sense of relief soon dissolved when Detective Reeves arrived at our cell with 2 uniformed officers. "Let's go, you two," he barked. "We're transporting you out of county lockup. District judge wants increased security so you're less flight risk before sentencing." Confused and rattled by this abrupt change, we were cuffed and ushered into an unmarked van. The detective climbed in front while the officers bracketed us on the narrow bench in back. After driving a while with no idea the destination, an unsettled feeling gnawed at my gut. Where were they taking us and why the sudden unexplained transfer? My fears amplified when Detective Reeves exited off the highway into an industrial area on the seedier side of town. He pulled behind a deserted warehouse and killed the engine. Before we could react, the fake cops whipped out guns, training the barrels on us menacingly. "End of the line," one growled. "Mr. Hartley sends his regards." Blind terror seized me then. This was a coordinated hit. Frank Hartley must be tying up loose ends for his mob partners. With Jack gone, we were expendable witnesses to their conspiracy. They planned to execute us and vanish the bodies. "Please don't do this," I begged frantically. "We'll give you anything you want. Money, property, it's all yours." The officer sneered. "Our compensation's already been arranged. Just making good on our end of the bargain." He cocked the hammer of his pistol while the driver grabbed Mark, shoving him out the van's back doors. The reality of my imminent death stared me down in that loaded gun muzzle. I squeezed my eyes shut as despair and regret for all I hadn't done consumed my final moments. Then, an ear-splitting cacophony of squealing tires and bullhorn sirens shattered the night. I snapped my eyes open disbelief to see a SWAT team swooping in to surround the van, automatic rifles aimed at us through shattered glass. Detective Reeve and his fake cops threw up their hands, cursing loudly. The SWAT leader bellowed through his mic for everyone to exit with hands raised. Still struggling to grasp this miracle twist, I complied on rubbery legs. Mark and I were swiftly separated from our would-be killers and checked for injuries by a paramedic. Detective Reeves and his men were forced to kneel on the pavement at gunpoint, cuffed and stuffed into squad cars for transport. I turned questioningly toward the SWAT leader removing his face shield. He gave us a sympathetic smile. "Greg Foster, State Police. We intercepted these creeps' plan and staged our own ambush. You folks have been through quite an ordeal from what I understand. But thankfully it's all over now. Thank God you got here when you did." Mark replied, embracing the man gratefully. "But how did you know?" Agent Foster sighed. "Seems your prosecutor had a crisis of conscience at the last minute. Turns out he was actually your estranged half-brother, Jake. He confessed everything to his mob associates, the elaborate plot, framing you, etc. Even told them where to find you." Stunned disbelief washed over me. The man pretending to be Jack, angling to destroy us and steal our inheritance, had been John's younger son all along, the one no one knew existed. Foster continued, "When Mr. Bianchi learned Jake betrayed them and wanted out, he sent men to eliminate him. Our department got an anonymous tip with the whole story and Jake's location. By the time we arrived, gunfire had already erupted between the two parties. I'm afraid your brother didn't survive the confrontation." His words hit like a speeding truck. The mastermind behind our torment, rotten as he was, had still been family. We were possibly the only people left who cared about him at all. Now he was gone too. The weight of so much senseless tragedy and death suddenly overwhelmed me. I broke down right there beside the SWAT van, great heaving sobs of equal parts grief and relief pouring out. Mark quickly folded me into his arms, likely experiencing similar conflicted emotions about his half-sibling. I unleashed it all, the hardship, fear, despair, and injustice accumulated these long, hellish months. We must have stood clinging to each other for a long while. Because when I finally stemmed my sobs and lifted my head, we were alone. The crime scene had cleared save for John's lawyers, who waited respectfully for us a short distance away. Seeing those familiar faces at last sparked an ember of hope inside me. Sympathetic allies had returned. Perhaps this unrelenting nightmare was finally drawing to a close. In the weeks following rescinding the false convictions and dismissal of all charges against us, Mark and I slowly attempted to rebuild our shattered lives. With John's legitimate will upheld and the devious fabricated one nullified, his estate was once again rightfully signed over to us. Not that material things much mattered anymore after all we'd endured. Detective Reeves and his two assassin cronies all received life sentences for their conspiracy crimes. Jake's mob associates disappeared back into the criminal underworld's shadows. Meanwhile, the truth about the elaborate scheme to frame us gradually came to light, restoring our reputations. Fair weather friends resumed contact, claiming they never actually believed those awful allegations. Their renewed sympathy felt hollow now, but we accepted cautiously. With Jake gone and his lies exposed, we finally felt closure about my poor father-in-law's death. In truth, I mourned for his wayward son too in those quiet moments, lamenting the unrealized possibility of reconciliation that haunted John during life. Perhaps in death, father and son could achieve some semblance of the peace that eluded them on this earthly plane. Our own peace came from withdrawing entirely from the immense wealth and stature my father's business provided, focusing instead on mental healing and each another's company. We moved far away to start over, hoping distance and time would help rebuild what was lost. I still awaken some nights in a cold sweat, flashing back to our nightmarish ordeal. Mark continues battling his own demons too. But together we are piecing things back together one day at a time. This experience taught us truth and love are the only things that matter in life, more than any worldly possessions or status. We emerged tested by fire, but our bond forever strengthened. And for that I am grateful.
This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your precious time. If you enjoyed this story, then please make sure you subscribe to this channel. That would help me a lot. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.